Very wonderful introduction. I always define social psychology in my introduction to social psychology course with the undergraduate students as the study of normal adult human interaction, which could clear this room, I suppose, because we're talking about normal adult, whatever that is. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the work I do. I'm very interested in the topic of hypocrisy, which some people would define as the homage that vice pays to virtue. For most people, we think of hypocrisy as occurring because there's this really fascinating disconnect between the moral code that people are willing to advocate that others should follow and their own behavior, as illustrated by this cartoon for Al Gore. This is a picture of Al Gore leaving the podium having won the Oscar for his film An Inconvenient Truth, which is, of course, promoting the importance of sustainable behaviors. And his hypocrisy appeared when shortly thereafter it was found out that his farm in Tennessee burns more electricity than anything within miles. And so it seemed as though he was advocating a course of action, sustainable behavior, that he himself, in fact, doesn't practice. It's really interesting when people have this disconnect between the things that they are willing to tell others that they should do and their own behavior, and thinking about the reasons for that disconnect can be a pretty fun exercise. But what I'm really interested in knowing is what happens when people come to realize that there's a disconnect between what they're willing to advocate, the standards for behavior that they believe in, and their own behavior. What happens when they realize that inconsistency, and when they realize that inconsistency, can it motivate them to make change? Can it motivate them to bring their behavior back into line with the things that they are willing to tell others that they should do? So, to investigate these kinds of questions, long ago when I was a graduate student working with Elliot Aronson, we came up with what we call the hypocrisy paradigm. And we define hypocrisy specifically as an act of advocating a pro-social behavior to others that one does not perform regularly. And what we believe happens when people advocate things that they themselves don't do, they realize this inconsistency between the advocacy and their past failures, and that arouses the state of cognitive dissonance, which is an unpleasant state of arousal, a state of psychological discomfort that people become motivated to reduce. And there's a lot of ways to reduce dissonance. Typically, in fact, if you know anything about the dissonance literature, you know that it's a lot of research showing people rationalizing their way out of these kinds of discrepancies. But one of the things that we predicted early on was that a hypocritical discrepancy very specifically focuses people on resolving their discomfort by changing their behavior, by bringing their behavior back into line with the things that they're willing to advocate to others. And in fact, Festinger, in his original book, noted that sometimes when people feel a sense of dissonance, they reduce it by, in fact, changing their behavior. And his classic example was people who smoke. How do people who smoke, on the one hand, smoke, and on the other hand, realize that that causes cancer? And he said, well, one of the ways you can resolve that is you can just quit smoking. And in fact, sometimes people do, in fact, quit smoking when they realize that they have this state of inconsistency. So why exactly then does hypocrisy lead to behavior change? Well, we argued in a recent review published in 2008, we think there's two reasons why people focus on behavior change as the route to dissonance reduction following hypocrisy. One is, typically in hypocrisy, in the studies we've done anyway, people are advocating a course of action that they really truly believe in. They are saying, hey, we should all exercise more regularly. We should eat right. We should use condoms to reduce our risk for sexually transmitted diseases. These are things that people truly do believe in, and because they truly believe in them and they typically reflect the norms for behavior, those cognitions are resistant to change. They're not likely to say, yeah, I said that, but I don't really believe it, or it's really not important to eat right to reduce your risk for cancer. So we think that these pro-social statements are highly resistant to change. But the other reason, theoretically for us, is that really what's at stake for people when they act hypocritically in this way is that what becomes salient to them is they've just acted in a dishonest and insincere manner. They've essentially been hypocritical about things that they care about, and so their self-integrity is challenged. And the most direct way to solve the problem for their self-integrity, because they want to believe they're honest and sincere, is to bring their behavior back into line with the things they advocate. That way they can feel like they were, in fact, being honest and sincere. So people are motivated to act more honest and sincere in the future by adopting the behavior that they advocate to others. So let me show you an example of this research. And this comes from the original work we did trying to motivate college students to practice safe sex. So what we did was we invited college students in to come in and help us develop a program designed to encourage safe sex among high school students. We told them, you're going to be a good person for this because you're just like high school students, a little older, a little more experienced. Help us create this program. And so the first thing we had them do was sit in front of a video camera, and they constructed a short, brief, persuasive message about the importance of, hey, when you come to college, if you're going to be sexually active, you need to be safe. And the safest way to be sexually active is to use a condom every single time you have sexual intercourse. That is the advocacy component of hypocrisy. After that, we said, okay, as part of this program, it'd be really useful to know, why don't college students use condoms all the time? So we asked them to sit down and think of all the times in the past when they hadn't used condoms, when they themselves had been sexually active. That's what we call the mindfulness factor in hypocrisy. And so they sat down and they wrote down things, and the most common things they write down are things like, you know, we had sex and we just forgot to get condoms, we forgot to buy them, we forgot to have them around. So the very first study we did, we just simply asked them as a result if they were going to be safe in the future, and what we found was that hypocrisy subjects reported less past use, so they seemed to be especially mindful of their past failures, but they also reported higher intentions to use condoms in the future compared to the control conditions. Now, we weren't satisfied with self-report of intentions, and so what we decided is to run a second study, because one of the things we think is that hypocrisy motivates people to take action. It's consistent with the kinds of things they're willing to advocate to others. And if given an opportunity to take action, to take the steps necessary to alter their behavior, they would be likely to do that. So what we did was set up a scenario at the end of a second study where we could sell them condoms. We paid them for being in the study, and we're very careful about the way we do this. We set it up so that we say, you know, here's your money for being in the study. Thanks for coming in. You're all done. Oh, I almost forgot. The health center provided us with condoms because they knew we do this research. So if you're all interested, they're only 10 cents each. Paid everybody $4 for being in the study, so we knew they had money. And then though, importantly, the experimenter says, well, thanks for coming in. I have to go set up for the next subject. You're free to go. And the experimenter leaves the room, leaving the subject alone to leave, or if they're interested, to stop by and purchase condoms. And what you can see is we found in the original study that subjects in the hypocrisy condition were significantly more likely, 83% of them were likely to stop and purchase condoms on their way out, compared to conditions where, for example, they just learned a lot about AIDS, conditions where they just made the speech and didn't do anything else, conditions where they were just made mindful of their past failures but didn't make a speech, and then full-blown hypocrisy, which is the combination of speech and mindful. As I said, there's a lot of ways to reduce your dissonance, and one of the things that we were curious to know after that was whether or not, in fact, if given other options for reducing their dissonance, it would in fact be easier, such as giving your money away to somebody that would help them but wouldn't solve your hypocrisy, would that be sufficient to reduce dissonance? So we set up the same scenario. We gave them an option to either donate their money to a homeless shelter or to purchase condoms on their way out. And what we found is that they were much more likely to want to purchase the condoms at the end, even though there was another way for them to reduce their dissonance that would be pretty cool and a lot easier. So it seemed to focus people on solving the hypocritical discrepancy as a result of that experience. So these were the original studies we did, and as you can see, it's all focused on trying to actually change people's health behavior. And one question you have right now, I'm sure, is, so are they using the condoms? And I'm going to say this right now. I'm going to come back to that question at the end of the talk, so hang on to it. I will address it at the end. What's happened since? Well, this review paper that we did and published in 2008, we went back and looked at the last 15 years of hypocrisy research to see what had become of it, and what we found is that there's a lot of people that have taken this idea and run with it. There's over 20 published studies, 4 dissertations. One thing I was pleased to see is the effect is cross-cultural, which there's been some debate about whether dissonance is a cross-cultural phenomenon, and one of the things that you can see is that there are some clever researchers in Japan, a collectivistic culture, that are getting great hypocrisy effects in a collectivistic culture, but also North America and Japan. And it's been effectively used to promote a number of pro-social behaviors, several health-related behaviors, the safe sex studies, exercise, smoking cessation, and I'll show you some sun protection data in a moment. Also for promoting sustainable behaviors, Al Gore would be very happy that we can do that. Water and energy consumption, recycling, safer driving. And then a number of interesting studies that I kind of put under a category of improving interpersonal relationships, because what they show is that you can use hypocrisy to reduce people's biases against certain groups, to get them to be more forgiving of someone who wrongs them, and to engage in charitable giving, generosity. One of the things we were interested in trying to understand in this review was, okay, so under what conditions does hypocrisy produce the greatest behavior change? And there are factors associated with the way in which people advocate the behavior to others that matter. One of the things that we see in this research is that it really does require people advocating the behavior to others. Just simply, for example, creating a speech but not delivering it doesn't engender the same effect on behavior change. And one of the interesting things that you can see in this literature is that there's an effect for whether or not when people advocate the course of action to others, they include themselves in what they say. And one of the findings in this literature is that when people advocate the course of action without saying, and I will do it too, that's when we see a really great effect for hypocrisy. But when people come in and just advocate the course of action without any commitment, you get almost no effect. And I'm really fascinated by this, right? Because you'd think that when people come in and sit in front of a video camera or write an essay that they think others are going to read saying, let's all engage in this health behavior, that psychological process, that commitment, would have a big effect on what people would do next. And in the slide I showed you a minute ago, one of the lowest compliance rates we get in all our studies is when people just come in and make the speech. And so there seems to be some active process going on there that's a little surprising. One interesting possibility is that when people sit and advocate a course of action, they now feel licensed to slide on it. I've done my part. And so there's this research on moral credentialing that seems related to this possibility. So there's something that happens when people advocate a course of action but don't include themselves in it. On the other hand, there are some studies that have shown that if in the course of the advocacy, if people say, we should all conserve electricity and all do it too, so they include themselves in it, then you actually see the speech alone having as great effect on behavior change as hypocrisy does. And there's some debate between me and Brian Spangenberg, a marketing researcher, about exactly what's going on here. And he essentially argues that through this process of self-prophecy, he calls it, advocating or predicting what you're going to do in the future is sufficient to arouse dissonance. I don't buy that. And I don't think there's any evidence to necessarily argue that, because what it assumes is that if I say I'm going to do something in the future, I automatically bring to mind the failures of not doing it in the past. That's essentially what Spangenberg argues happens, and I don't actually think there's any evidence for that, and we've got studies that don't support that. So basically, I think that what the literature suggests is that in order to have hypocrisy motivate behavior change, the best way to go about it is to definitely make people mindful of their past failures in a systematic way when they advocate the course of action. So that's what I think we understand about publicity and also commitment. What about making people mindful? And one of the interesting things in the literature is that you can't just make people mindful of failure in a general sense. You have to make people mindful of their own personal failures in order to engender the effect of hypocrisy on behavior change. But there's one really important issue. Ron and I were talking about this just a minute ago. You can't humiliate people about their past failures. And Carrie Fried, a colleague of mine in grad school, did a really great study where she brought people in. It was a study on promoting recycling behavior, had people advocate recycling, then manipulated the publicity of their past failures. In one condition, they wrote down all the times in the past when they hadn't recycled, and then that was done privately. They didn't sign it. There was no identifying information. They put it in an envelope with a bunch of other ones, so it was very private. In another condition, once they wrote down their failures, the experimenter picked it up and read it out loud to them. And what she found was that at the end of the study, when asked if they would recycle more often in the future and if they'd be willing to sign up for a recycling program, the subjects who had been made mindful privately signed up, 80% for the recycling center. The subjects who had been publicly identified with their past transgressions didn't sign up for the recycling center. They said recycling's not important. So they trivialized it. And I think the important point that makes is that when it comes to making people realize their hypocrisies about the things they know they should do but they don't, it's really important that they're allowed to discover that on their own, that they're not publicly humiliated through that process. I think if you back people in a corner in that way with this kind of approach, all you're going to do is force them to save face, trivialize the importance of the behavior, and you probably won't see any behavior change. And then a final interesting finding is that there's a study showing that when you make people mindful for past failures, you really need to focus them on recent past failures, not ancient, as I'm calling it, past failures. And one interesting explanation for that is the possibility that when people look way back on past failures, they think, oh, I'm a different person now. And so that's not really relevant to who I am, and as a result, they don't change their behavior. But focusing me on failures from last week, 2 weeks ago, last month, that makes me think, oh, I need to do something about this. Okay, so that's the review portion of what we've done. Now let me show you some new data that we're still working on. One of the things that we discovered in doing our review is that nobody had really addressed a really kind of obvious question, for us at least, with respect to how hypocrisy operates. And that is the question of how much mindfulness do you need to get people to engage in order for them to realize their hypocrisy, feel dissonance, become motivated to change? You know, a couple of failures, 10 failures? And you can make a prediction directly from Festinger's original theory of dissonance about what should be necessary here. Festinger said that the magnitude of dissonance, the magnitude of the discomfort that people feel, is a function of the ratio of the important inconsistent to consistent cognitions. And the idea is that the more inconsistent cognitions that people are dealing with, the higher the dissonance ratio, the more discomfort, the more motivation for change. And what that would lead to is a very straightforward prediction, which is that advocates who recall more failures are going to generate more inconsistent cognitions. That's going to lead to much more dissonance, more discomfort, more motivation to change. And so just straight from Festinger's original theory, recalling more past failures should lead to more behavior change. The thing is that there's other research that suggests that the opposite might be true. Could more be less? And in fact, some very interesting research on what's called self-validation processes by Zach Tormala looks something like this. What he argues is that when people think really carefully about an example of a behavior, so you ask them to really mull over an example, to, for example, recall instances of a specific type of behavior. What people do, if they're thinking carefully, is they think, well, you know, when was the time I didn't use sunscreen? They also go, but there was this time I did. And they start to recruit consistent cognitions. They start recruiting the opposite of what you've asked them to think about. And what that leads to is an interesting possibility that if you ask people to recall a lot of past failure and they're thinking carefully about it, they're going to recall more successes as well. And what that leads to is a balanced ratio of inconsistent to consistent cognitions, which according to Festinger, that's going to lead to less dissonance. And so that leads to the prediction that recalling fewer past failures in a very careful way means people will recall less success. That's going to create a higher ratio of inconsistent to consistent cognitions. That's going to cause the most dissonance. So according to a self-validation interpretation of this, when, again, people think very carefully, what we call high elaboration, they're thinking a lot about what you've asked them to ponder. People who recall fewer past failures should experience more dissonance and more behavior change following hypocrisy. Now that, of course, naturally begs the opposite side of the equation, which is, well, what if people don't think carefully? What if they do this very, in what we call low elaboration in a very heuristic fashion? And in fact, there were two theories that we thought, or two heuristics that we thought people might rely on. On the one hand, well-known phenomenon in the cognitive literature is the ease of retrieval heuristic. And here what's been shown in many, many studies by Norbert Schwartz and colleagues is that when people recall examples of something, they not only use the content, but they can also use the ease with which it comes to mind as a signal as to how important that information is. And what that leads to is the possibility that when advocates think of past failures in a very simple way, they could focus on the subjective ease. And what that would mean is that recalling more past failures, well, that's hard to do. If I ask people to think of 10 times in the past when they didn't use sunscreen, they get to 4 or 5, and then it becomes difficult, and they go, gosh, this is hard, I must not have a problem, right? Versus if they think of only a couple, well, that's easy. And they go, wow, that was easy, I must have a problem. And so what that leads to is the possibility that, again, when people aren't thinking too carefully about this, they do it in a very quick heuristic fashion, recalling fewer failures under low elaboration means more dissonance and more behavior change. The other possibility is that people simply count. If you ask people to come up with 10 versus 2, 8 versus 2, they simply just count how many they came up with. 2 is less than 8, and that's what we call a numerosity heuristic. People just simply count. And what that would suggest is that if you have people recall more past failure under low elaboration, they just simply say, wow, that's a lot of failure. And they conclude that that's a problem. Versus if they recall fewer past failures, they say, that's only 2. I must not have a problem. And as a result, there's going to be less dissonance. So essentially in this study, we were testing 3 predictions for how recalling how many past failures would lead to the most dissonance and the most behavior change. One that was specific to when people think carefully, and then 2 predictions for when people don't think too carefully. So how do we test this? Well, I specifically was talking about sunscreen because that's in fact the thing we've been doing a lot lately, is trying to motivate college students to acquire and use sunscreen more regularly as a way to reduce their risk for skin cancer. In this study we had 90 female participants, all of them with positive attitudes toward using sunscreen, but also reported to us in a mass pretest that they don't use it all the time, which is really sort of when hypocrisy should work best. They came in and they wrote an an essay advocating sun-protected behaviors that they thought that freshman students were going to read, so it had that public advocacy. We also took their picture and told them that we'd include their picture in what we were doing. Then we had them think back on their past failures to use sunscreen, and here's where we manipulated the processes that I referred to earlier. Under one condition, we had them recall their past failures in a high elaboration way, and what you see here is a standard way of manipulating this in the persuasion literature in social psychology, basically by making people highly responsible for the information they provide. So what we told them was that the National Cancer Institute was interested in collecting this information, and it's very important for you to know that this survey is being distributed to only a very small amount of people across the nation, so their answers are very important. So they're highly responsible for what they're going to tell us, okay? In a low elaboration condition, you take responsibility away, you make people less responsible, they start to process more heuristically, and to do that we said, just so you know, the survey is being distributed to thousands of people across the nation because we have to send them out all the time. And that's designed to get them to think, oh, I can do this quickly and I don't have to pay too much attention. But then what we manipulated next was whether they recalled either 2 past failures to use sunscreen or 8. Okay. The next thing was we wanted to measure whether or not they are interested in acquiring a sample of sunscreen as our dependent measure. And so what we did was set it up so that same thing like with the condom purchasing DVs, where we say, thanks for coming in, you're free to go. Oh, I almost forgot, here's our this opportunity to acquire a sample of sunscreen from the program. If you want it, you just have to fill this information out, drop it in this box, and at that point the experimenter says, I got to go meet somebody for lunch, thanks for coming in, you're free to go, and they leave, leaving the subject alone to decide, do you want to do this or do you want to just go, because you're free to go. And they also indicate which SPF they want, which we don't get any effect on. Okay, so what do we find? Well, just to show you the manipulation checks, the evidence that, in fact, these manipulations operate like they're supposed to. When they were only asked to recall 2 past failures, that's all they recalled. When they were asked to recall 8, they got really close, 7.76. And then we also wanted a manipulation check on the degree to which the effort they were putting into their recall, and we do get a main effect for elaboration in the direction where there's more effort being put in under high versus low elaboration. With respect to the percentage of subjects that acquired a sample of sunscreen, what we get is under high elaboration, we get evidence for the self-validation prediction. 82% of the subjects acquired the sample of sunscreen when they only thought of 2 failures versus 52% when they thought about 8 failures, which supports the self-validation idea that when they think about 8 failures, they start to recruit instances of success using sunscreen. That diminishes the dissonance, and they're less motivated to want to acquire the sunscreen as a result. Under the low elaboration, we don't get ease of retrieval, we get the numerosity heuristic, it looks like, because 8 is leading, thinking of 8 failures is leading to more acquisition of sunscreen than thinking of only 2 past failures. Now, this is great behavioral data as far as we're concerned for the kinds of things we're interested in. But of course, what you don't see is any evidence of the mediational processes that I'm talking about. That's a study that's underway right now where we're essentially trying to directly measure and then test mediation in a Barron-Kenney approach by asking people to tell us how many failures and successes they came up with when they did this, and then looking to see if that mediates the purchasing in the way, or I'm sorry, the acquisition in the way you see here. So this is ongoing research, but we're certainly encouraged. Okay, so let me now talk about the elephant in the room. Because I know I've stood here for the last 20 minutes or so and talked about behavior change. One of the things that we always are asked when we try to publish this work is this really behavior change we're seeing? I mean, people acquire a sample of sunscreen, people purchase condoms and leave. How do you know they're using them? And we've tried some things in the past that haven't been terribly successful, like calling people up 3 months later to see how many condoms they're using. Not surprisingly, you get big ceiling effects on questions like that, and so it's really difficult to measure actual behavior. And as somebody that spends a lot of time creating these kinds of behavioral measures, I'm really queasy when it comes to self-report. I just don't. I'm not a big fan all the time. I'd rather see something like this. And so we are currently trying to do research where we're looking more carefully at follow-ups that are more directly behavioral than self-report. But let me talk about this more conceptually, because I think there's a lot of really interesting issues with respect to thinking about health behavior change. And as you know, there are many stages of health behavior change. And there are many stage and step models of health behavior change: theory of planned behavior, of course, trans-theoretical model, health belief model, protection motivation theory. All of these are theories of health behavior change that essentially say people need to go through a series of steps in order to change their health behavior. And these have been around for a long time. I think one of the most important developments that's come out with respect to understanding health behavior change in recent years is Alex Rothman's work. If you don't know his work, highly recommend you look at it if you're interested in the question of health behavior change. And he's drawn a really important distinction that I think we need to pay attention to and everybody needs to pay attention to, which is between interventions, something like hypocrisy, that leads people to start a new health behavior, and interventions that lead people to maintain that health behavior over time. And his argument is that most interventions can produce initiation of a new health behavior. Few interventions, if any, actually lead to maintenance of that behavior over time. And so the question and the challenge for all of us becomes, what does it really take to get a new behavior that people are willing to initiate to last? And Rothman's argument is that, part of the problem is the psychological processes that dictate the initiation of a new behavior are different than the psychological processes that determine the maintenance of that behavior over time. And that's why a lot of the interventions don't work. They're really good at getting those processes going for intervention or for initiation, but not so much for maintenance. Well, one of the things that we talked about at the end of this review paper, and we're now starting to do some research on, is thinking about, so how could you use hypocrisy at both the initiation phase, but more importantly also at the maintenance phase? And I'll just talk a little bit about some of this. So with respect to behavior initiation, which is where I really think most of our work has been, I do think that hypocrisy can be used really effectively for targeting specific stages or steps in initiation. And so when you look at the early stages of change for people, right, you have problems of people not being aware of what the changes they need to make. Maybe they're aware, but they're uninformed about the benefits. Or maybe they're informed, they know what the benefits are, but they really don't know how to actually get started, right? And so one of the things I think that you can use hypocrisy to do, and it follows directly from dissonance theory, is get people in these early stages in a state of hypocrisy where what they're motivated to do is to learn how to enact the new behavior. And the idea that I'm gravitating toward with this thinking is this idea that hypocrisy may create a teachable moment for people. It puts people in a state of discomfort that needs to be solved by learning how to start doing this behavior, by learning what the behavior is, by learning how to, what the benefits of the behavior are, by learning how to actually enact the behavior. So hypocrisy could be used not to necessarily get people to acquire condoms, but to learn why they should acquire condoms. And so the dependent measures in studies like that would really be things like, here's some information, and see if they then want to read it, consume it, get more of it, seek it out, and so on. The fourth stage is the planning to change. Here people have knowledge, intentions, they have the goals to change, they just haven't done anything yet. And I think this is where the majority of our studies have operated. We're taking people that really do know what they're supposed to do in terms of these health behaviors, they just aren't doing it. And they aren't doing it, or they aren't doing it as regularly as they could. And that's what I think we've shown to this point, is that hypocrisy is really effective for getting people to take the steps necessary to initiate these behaviors, okay? So what about maintenance? And maintenance is a tough one. When you look at across the entire literature, hypocrisy literature, not just the stuff I've done, one of the things that you see is that there is mixed evidence for the long-term effect of hypocrisy on behavior change. There's one really fascinating study that was done in the 80s down in Australia with energy conservation, and what they did was send people homeowners who believed in the importance of energy conservation, a little letter in the mail that said, you're wasting a lot of electricity. So they took people that were pro energy conservation, made them mindful of the fact that they were wasting electricity. Then they followed their electrical use, so it's actually measuring their behavior through their electricity consumption for 2 weeks, and found that the hypocrisy people used less electricity for 2 weeks. Impressive. So there is some evidence like that we can point to say, okay, maybe there are conditions under which this works. When I think about what it would take to, encourage health behavior maintenance, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is inducing hypocrisy to get people to initiate the behavior, but then sending them reminders of their hypocrisy down the road as a way to reinstate their dissonance. And there is evidence in the literature that you can remind people of a previous discrepancy, 2 weeks later, and that dissonance will come back to them, and they will engage in dissonance reduction strategies. So that seems like a possible way to go with hypocrisy. But the other thing that I think is possible, and this is a study we're running actually right now, is most of our studies have been focusing people on being hypocritical about engaging in the behavior one time, or engaging in the behavior now. We've never done a study until now thinking about making people hypocritical about long-term behavior change. And so the study, for example, that we're running right now is people come in and they advocate the importance of not just eating more fruits and vegetables to reduce your risk of cancer next meal, but doing it every meal for the rest of your life. So we're really focusing them on the idea that the things they're doing now don't lead to these long-term changes. So that's seems to me one possible way to go at making the discrepancy about long-term behavior change. We can also think about things like using implementation intentions, getting people to advocate that if I'm at the refrigerator, then I grab an apple kinds of connections, and making them hypocritical about those kinds of connections, those very specific behavioral examples of the right behavior. And then, of course, making them mindful of the fact that they don't do that. So these are some of the ways in which I think if we're going to get serious about long-term behavior change, we have to think about the psychological mechanisms of long-term behavior change. And I do think hypocrisy provides us with a way to think about doing that. Okay, so let me go ahead and wrap up then. So take-home points are that the inconsistency and the dissonance that comes from hypocrisy can motivate behavior change. I think of it as it works great for things that people know they should do, but they don't. And that's what you're making them aware of, is the fact that they know they should do this, but they don't. So people have to be favorable toward the behavior. They have to agree that it's something they should do, but also not perform it regularly. Obviously, if they do it 100% of the time, tough to make them aware of a discrepancy, right? And it works best when people publicly advocate the behavior and then are importantly, privately made mindful of recent personal failures to engage in the behavior. And we also have another line of research. We've become really interested in the question of what happens if you witness somebody else's hypocrisy? Under what conditions would that motivate you to want to change your own behavior because somebody else was hypocritical? And what we find in some studies is that to the degree that you share a strong social identity, a strong social bond with that person, you experience a sense of vicarious hypocrisy, and you become motivated to protect the integrity of the group that the two of you represent by changing your own behavior. And as I alluded to earlier, we found, and lots of people now have found, that hypocrisy can change behavior related to a wide range of pro-social behaviors. But it is the case, I think, that the effects on behavior initiation are much more established at this point than the effects on behavior maintenance, but certainly I think there's a lot of room to investigate that. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Yes, Lee.